the description. We're unscripted, we're not going to have any real long opening slideshows, so we just want to start by everybody taking a minute to a minute and a half introducing themselves, starting with Sebastien.
Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you Jim for organizing this session. Sebastien Houde. 1 minute to summarize who I am, summarize what I've done. The last 10 years I've studied why US households purchase or don't purchase energy efficient refrigerators. So basically this is the focus of my research, and I've tried any possible ways to find why this is the case or why it's not the case. I started, Jim was my advisor, but Stanford, so I started with neuroeconomics and studying neural decision. And I said, okay, it won't do it. Then I studied a bit more behavioral issues. So I studied behavioral economics and tried to make sense of that. And then I turned toward more big data and econometrics, and it's what I'm doing mainly in my research these days. And so today, provide insights on behavioral issues in my exploration.
Hi, I'm Karen Palmer. I'm a senior fellow at Resources for the Future in Washington. I guess for the last 15 years, I've worked a lot on energy efficiency, both from the perspective of trying to understand the energy efficiency gap and sort of cataloging causes and implications for policy. A lot of that work has been done with and also with Richard, some of the work. And I think another way that I'm trying to contribute in terms of policy is helping to advocate for better evaluation of energy efficiency policies, both with the goal of sort of understanding what we're getting for the money we're spending and understanding how we can make those policies better. This is particularly important in the context of the now urban clean power plan, where there was the potential of getting credit for carbon reductions associated with expenditures on energy efficiency. So it's important to understand how we're going to work. Recent work I've been doing with other colleagues at RFF is focused on the introduction of smart technology and its implications for both energy consumption and for consumer welfare, where we're focusing on smart thermostats and we're looking at implications for
Okay, great. I'm Ken Gillingham. I'm an associate professor at Yale University, primarily in the art school, focusing on the economics department, school management. My research falls into three main areas: the adoption of new energy technologies, on energy efficiency, so it's carrying work going back quite a few years on this renewal as well, and on transportation. And many of these areas intersect with understanding demand, understanding consumer demand. So not all of my work is on consumer demand, but I have been quite interested in understanding how consumers make decisions about energy efficiency, about, at the individual household level, the adoption of renewables such as solar PV, as well as understanding more broadly the consumer response to changes in things like gasoline prices or even policies. That's been my general research agenda.
I'm Sweeney. I'm a faculty member in the Management Science and Engineering Department. Up until recently, I was the director of the Precourt Energy Efficiency Center at Stanford. I'm director because we ran out of money and the center doesn't exist anymore. That's a way of losing a job. What are you doing? And I've actually been involved in many elements of the energy system since beginning of 1973, where I was in energy modeling back at the old Federal Energy Administration. Colleagues back here have been in energy, used to run the energy modeling forum before John Lyons done such a spectacular job. And I've more recently been focusing on energy efficiency and the combination of the economic and the behavioral and policy issues that have shaped the energy demand. So, this is a session entitled Energy Demand and Behavioral Considerations. We're going to try to blend those. The structure is a bunch of questions. We're going to start with some abstract questions about the underlying forces, then go to things that are more directly focused at energy demand. We'll try to save 10 or 15 minutes for questions that'll be interactions with the audience, and we'll go from there. No opening PowerPoint presentations, although you may get a slide or two in the middle. So let me start with the first question. First, what types of changes do you see as most important or really important in understanding future patterns of energy demand and future trends? Let's start with the physical changes that are important, and Ken, you might want to start with that.
Sure, I'll start us off. First underlying energy demand is obviously, and this is not exactly physical, although physical, is income. I mean, this is dominant. So when we think about global energy demand, not just U.S. energy demand, global incomes and rising global incomes are just crucial to understanding this. There is an enormous amount of unmet energy demand in the world, and this is going to play a huge role in the patterns that we're going to be seeing going forward. But I'm going to move to more physical.
I cut them up. They got to put the mics closer.
When we're looking at developed countries and even many middle-income countries, electrification is becoming an incredibly important physical force that's playing a role. We see this in the now not so nascent electric vehicles. Some of you in this room probably own electric vehicles, but there's still a small portion of the market. But there's also a movement towards electrification more broadly. In Europe in particular, there's been a movement towards electrifying heating, well, it's already cooling, but heating as well. These can really play a role in changing some patterns in demand more broadly. In addition to this, there's energy efficiency. Now this is something that's actually, looking at, say, the US, has been a very, very steady line of improvement in energy efficiency over quite a few years going back. And actually, it's almost remarkable how steadily improving a few percent a year this has been through many different administrations, Republican, Democrat, it didn't matter. This steady improvement has been continuing. There's been sometimes greater policy activity in energy efficiency and other times less policy activity, but we still see this very, very, very steady line. And that is playing a role, because underpinning that are policies, but also our technologies. And then finally, I want to mention a physical change, at least in the U.S., is when we're looking at demand for primary fuels, you have to mention natural gas, and that there's been a dramatic change in movement of demand for primary fuels, not at the final end-use level. And without mentioning that, I feel remiss. I'm sure Karen has several more things to add to this.
Yeah, what would you like to add?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to look forward to until, well, maybe for quite a while, is our changes in the climate, and particular changes in average temperature and warming that might be going on. And that, combined with economic development, is likely to lead to an increase in demand for energy for cooling services. So changes in our physical environment are going to have an important effect. Another thing is a lot of things that you can't really necessarily anticipate or predict quite well related to changes in the structure of the economy or new technologies. So for example, changes in the economy, to the extent that more and more states legalize cannabis, and indoor agriculture becomes a productive way. Now, it may be that if states legalize cannabis, the price goes down and this is less attractive, but indoor agriculture is seen as a potential new area for electrification, so that could be a growing area of energy demand. But there's also other things going on with respect to technology developments like additive manufacturing or modular construction of homes, all of which could really change the way our our energy consumption looks in the future compared to the way it is today. And it's definitely, I guess another thing I would say is there's a lot of other little end uses of electricity. I mean, we all go home at night and you plug in, you know, my husband plugs in his golf thing that finds the distance to the hole, and you know, your iPad, your phone, and if you look at the most recent recs, I mean, the share of energy consumption associated with space cooling has come down because there's lots of other ways that we're using energy in our homes, and perhaps those will be growing.
Okay, those are some of the physical changes, but then there's behavioral issues underlying these. What do we need to know about behaviorally to start thinking about these, one of the big forces?
But, I mean, if you think about projection of energy demand, then I will follow on Ken's thoughts. Income, from my point of view, is the first order driver of energy demand in terms of to understand where this is going in projections. And what I'm finding also, if you look at the empirical work, not at the global level, but even micro level, one of the best predictor of different type of biases, or what you suspect that are biases with respect to energy efficiency, is income. So this is a good point to start, is to think about heterogeneity and to think about different income groups being subject to different type of biases. Now the question of which type of biases different income groups are subject to, that is a more difficult question. And to be honest, myself, and I don't think the literature has done a good job to, we are not there yet to try to provide an answer. What are the portfolio of behavioral bias at play that explain future energy demand? But again, I would say that income is a good point to start at the global and also at the micro level. And just to expand a bit on that, low-income households face a different set of constraints, additional environment than higher or more affluent households. And so the range of behavioral issues and neoclassical issues are very different across the country. So I think a nice agenda to think about how to better project energy demand is to be a bit more careful and maybe do empirical work at a finer scale and think about different income groups.
Yeah, do you want to comment on sort of energy efficiency gap?
Right.
You're thinking about that.
So there are many different factors that go into that are potential explanations of the energy efficiency gap, and I think it's a multifaceted thing. So no one is right, and we're still learning more and more about that. You know, some are related to actual costs that are underestimated associated with particular investments that you might make. For example, like getting an audit on your home is something that we've studied. I mean, there are a lot of costs associated with that aren't taken into account when you look at an energy efficiency potential assessment, because they're sort of soft costs, so to speak. But there's also behavioral issues such as inattention to energy costs, because basically some of the decisions related to how much energy you use are made at the time when you buy the capital stock that is going to consume the energy. And to the extent that energy costs aren't a big part of your budget, or you're just really facing a big upfront cost associated with some piece of equipment, that may dominate, and you may not actually optimize over what it really costs to operate that equipment over the lifetime. So in addition, there are, a number of behavioral issues, again, have been identified, and I can refer you to several papers that Ken and I have done, that have been hypothesized as associated with the energy efficiency gap, but I think the empirical evidence with respect to them is fairly weak. We do know that people do care about what other people do in terms of energy consumption, and so programs like O-Power, which provides information about how you're performing relative to like people, has been demonstrated to have an effect on reducing energy use in a way, and that's something that utilities have embraced pretty broadly in trying to achieve their efficiency goals.
Can I just interject? I wonder if it's it's useful to define the energy efficiency gap. Maybe many of you in the room are very familiar, maybe deeply familiar with it, but some others might not be. And there are several different ways to define the energy efficiency gap to begin with. And the most common way to define it might be the difference between a socially optimal level of diffusion of energy technologies or level of energy efficiency and what people actually choose. So that is setting, including externalities in there. You can also define it where you separate out externalities and take those, so by externalities here I'm referring to, say, pollution externalities and other externalities from electricity production and generation. And so that's another way that people have been defining the energy efficiency gap. And I agree with Karen in trying to parse this energy efficiency gap. First of all, there's long been evidence. People have long argued that this energy efficiency gap exists. It goes back quite a few years. Many of you may be familiar with a very prominent report by McKinsey. They did this for Vattenfall that shows many negative cost options for carbon mitigation. So these negative cost options are presumably money on the table. Why are we leaving this money on the table is the question, right? And so the energy efficiency gap is about the gap between what people are actually doing, seeming to leave money on the table, and what it would seem to make sense for them to do, not leave the money on the table, is another way to put it. So that's kind of fundamentally what this energy efficiency gap is about. And then the question is, why are they leaving money on the table? And I think Karen did a nice job already at laying out some of the first of all, challenges in this literature and confusion in this literature about where it comes from and where it might come from. That there are a variety of hypotheses for this gap, some of which relate to reasons that it's not a gap. And there are some papers out there that argue that it's not a gap. And Alcott and Greenstone paper, for example, argues it's in Journal of Economic Perspective that there's not much of a gap, and that it's all about that people are just miscalculating the costs. So, or there are hidden costs, and that was what Karen was alluding to. So I just want to flesh that out. That would be really an analyst problem. But then there could also be some true behavioral biases, and that there's a lot of work in behavioral economics, going back to Kahneman and Tversky and many other papers, that indicate that there are important behavioral biases that may influence decision making. And some of these are more likely to be influencing intertemporal decision making, or decision making when we're relating to energy efficiency. So in these situations where you have an upfront cost, like energy efficiency, and then you get rewards down the line, the payoffs from that upfront cost, there's some real questions that arise. And so Karen did a nice job about some of those explanations. I could flesh out a few more of those explanations, but I don't want to monopolize the time right now.
Well, but before you do, there's a distinction that I think we need to get on the table because you talked about the social benefits and the social costs, and then we talk about the individual behavioral biases having to do with that we see by, I would define it as almost, economists define it as a bias that people behave different than the theoretical economic model says they're supposed to. That is, it doesn't look like they're maximizing utility under a budget constraint, so we call it a bias. Maybe it's not, maybe it is, maybe it's not. But there may be a difference between positive versus a normative point of view. And positive being, and does somebody want to talk about that to get that distinction on the table so we have it clear as we're going forward? Sebastian, you want to pick that one up?
When you go in the data and you try to explain, let's say, the energy efficiency gap, you would have to take it, okay, so if you see consumers don't reap the full benefits of a given investment, then you have to explain why this is the case. And this is where that, we have our normative view of what is a good or a bad decision based on utility maximization. From a normative point of view, we can take a stand on, okay, this is a good or a bad decision. From a positive point of view, we just observe decisions and this is what it is. So, in terms of, is it important to make that distinction of behavioral bias being something neoclassical, part of utility maximization, or to call it a bias? In my work, I've convinced myself that this is probably important from a normative point of view, for the design of policy. If your goal is to predict energy demand or you care about energy modeling, electricity markets, and so on, that distinction is not that much important. And there's a subtlety that we came to appreciate in that there's kind of a small literature these days doing kind of behavioral policy design, like behavioral public finance. And there's a lot of work being done, okay, what would be the optimal, let's say, income tax if consumers or household or present bias, or what would be the optimal social security plan if people are subject to the default options. So there's a lot of paper out there in behavioral public finance trying to take into account biases and model the optimal policy. And people have done that also in the energy domain. And the key thing in that literature is that heterogeneity in biases is first order. So it's not only important to know if there is a gap or not, what is important is to know the distribution of that energy gap. And that will determine, okay, how you adjust your policy. And what we discovered also is that within the family of biases, what is important also to take into account is if you think about biases, you need also to take account what we call kind of the nature of the friction, without going too much into detail. There are some biases that, let's say, search costs or rational inattention. You might think that, well, the reason that people don't pay attention to energy costs is because it takes time, effort, or you have to invest real economic costs to pay attention to information. When this is the case, the policy recommendation is that there is not that much of a rationale to adjust the optimal policy to take account those biases. So in the whole family of biases, the ones that are associated with real economic costs, asset costs, time, and so on, don't really require, from a normative point of view, to adjust the optimal policy. So, long story short, if you look at biases, maybe this is not too important to distinguish or to systematically identify all the types of biases, but to have a rough idea of are those biases associated with other economic costs. This is kind of important from a normative point of view. So this is the recent research on behavioral public finance applied to energy. This is what the system is.
But that suggests to me some implications of our whole theory of welfare economics and our whole theory of how one evaluates public policies. Because the duality between competitive equilibrium and economic efficiency depends upon some notion that people are rationalizing, having rational decision making as economists have defined them. Now, if you start having put in some of these behavioral realities and say, hey, that is what people want to do, even though it doesn't look like optimizing, and you roll that to welfare economics and a benefit cost analysis and all the other things we do by depending upon price as measures of cost, do we have to rethink welfare economics in order to, is the whole structure of how we're working sort of, pretty shaky now?
This is what the behavioral public finance is doing nowadays to put a bit of grain of salt in the frictionless model of utility maximization, and then people are revisiting the classic of welfare economics with small biases, but one bias at a time, more or less. This is how this is happening, but mean, the research is, there is some advance in that behavioral welfare economics, and the framework is slowly emerging, and it can be applied. I think I've seen, in my work, we have been able to, my co-authors, to play a bit with welfare economics and take impact on biases.
Okay, Karen, maybe you could take a shot.
Well, I think one way to think about this is that the difference between your decision utility and your experience utility, and so due to a whole bunch of biases, say you're too focused on the present and not on the future, or you have kind of a addictive behavior that lets you, have long discounting when it comes to things that are far away, which are just kind of. So what that does is you're making decisions based on one view of yourself and how things are going to ultimately play out, but what your experience is different. And so what a welfare analysis would have to do to adjust for that is kind of find a way to translate from one to the other. And there is literature on this, right, Ken?
There's some literature on this. To add to that, Karen and I, in some of our work, distinguish between behavioral failures, which are analogous to market failures, and these would be normative perspective biases in which there's a very clear difference between the ex-ante decision or decision utility and the ex-post experienced utility. So that would be the utility when you actually later on experience having the good and getting those payoffs. So there really is an intertemporal element here that's very, very critical. And so those are what we call behavioral failures, and we distinguish those from behavioral anomalies, which may be other seemingly confusing aspects of consumer decision making. So they're very useful for understanding things from a positive perspective. So if you want to predict, for example, the adoption of technology, you may want to pay very close attention to those from a positive perspective, but they may not provide a rationale for policy from a normative perspective. And so it really comes down to whether there's a difference between the decision utility at the time you're making this decision and what happens afterwards. Do you actually take into account and realize the future benefits you're going to be getting from the decision that you're making today to, say, put in a more efficient appliance or buy a more efficient car or something along those lines? And that's really where it comes down to this. And there's some anomalies that people have pointed to that are easier to justify as something from a normative perspective, where there is this deviation from decision utility, from the difference between decision utility and experience utility and others. So we mentioned inattention. So if you happen to be, for a behavioral bias reason, inattentive to future fuel costs, that might provide a bias. But it could be rational inattention. So there's a work by Jim Salee in which he has a paper where he talks about rational intention, and Carrie Smith talks about this in a paper as well, where people are actually factoring in search costs and other costs where making the more efficient choice might actually have costs associated with it, and that you have so many decisions that you have to make in your life, and so there actually could be a cognitive cost attached to it. Distinguishing between these is a very, very challenging aspect to this, but also pretty crucial from the policy perspective, and I think very interesting.
Now, if I were an energy modeler and I wanted and said, hey, look at income, prices, technologies, utilities, optimize, do a general equilibrium model, do all of those things, and you're telling me there's a bunch of other things. Are you describing second-order effects, just small deviations things from that? Or actually first-order things that if you're into energy modeling and you want to get an understanding about the future, you better start getting right. So first-order, second-order, what are we talking about?
I think it depends on what level you're focusing on. I mean, in terms of like the standard in the US for predicting energy demand is the modeling that's done at EIA using the Evans model. And a lot of that is done based on existing data and econometric approaches. So if these behavioral biases that are embedded in the data that they're using are continuing into the future, this sort of reduced form approach may not be that bad. Now, it's not going to necessarily catch all the changes in technology and opportunities that we've talked about here, but those behavioral stuff isn't going to really speak to that necessarily.
You know, that's one answer. But what if? But what if new information technologies are coming in that are now allowing people to see some things they didn't see otherwise? And what if you have people on one end or the other of the policy spectrum saying, hey, look, this has been the trends, but we know that we can demand zero carbon, for example, from our society by having an adjustment. And how comfortable are we to know that those trends are going to continue if the whole information technology is adjusting around us?
The trends being towards
Well, whatever trends we're looking at here.
No, I mean, I think
it's built into the econometric relationships.
right. I think we can't have a lot of confidence. I mean, there are, at some level, of course, income is an important driver, but there are a lot of new technologies that are coming in and new opportunities. You know, we talked about automation of cars, but even more important, the sort of transportation as a service thing, which is so, I have a 23-year-old daughter, and it's really real in that generation. And you know what? It just changed because these electric scooters came along, and now she's figured out that if she takes an Uber to dinner, that's $4. If she takes a scooter, it's 85 cents. It's a little bit more risky, but anyway, she's taking those scooters. So there are a lot of disruptive things happening with respect to technology that also, I did not realize until I went to a workshop at University of Maryland recently that there's a ton of heterogeneity with respect to the energy efficiency of cars, even if you hold roots and models constant. And there's a study by, are you familiar with this? Work by Sean McRae and Andrea Langer, that, Ashley, thank you, that looks at this issue about, you know, we think, oh, a particular car, you're going to get, you know, the energy efficiency or the fuel use associated with traveling certain distances the same across all users. No, it's not the same. And it's not just about the way people drive their cars. It's about things about the environment around them. So, long story here, but getting to the point that if you have a system where you have a car that's smart and can talk to the infrastructure around it, like the lights and other aspects and other cars, that you could actually improve the energy efficiency of commuting and other vehicle use a lot. So there's a lot of things out there that it's hard to, that aren't behavioral necessarily, you know, that they take advantage of behavioral things that are going to make it difficult to predict. I think those are bigger.
Okay.
But,
And just to follow on the, maybe specifically on the energy modeling and how to introduce behavior and those big models. One thing that we to go with the information technology and their role in changing behavior, I think it's not too hard to take that into account because a lot of behavioral bias are specific to decision maker, and there's enough research, or we'll have more research as time will pass, that shows that in general, you know, energy elasticity or demand elasticity change by X% if you introduce that type of technology. So now we have kind of a range of estimates that we know that say that the consumers' response to dynamic pricing is much more pronounced if we also provide information. So there's enough studies that we can do, let's say, meta-analysis, and an energy modeler will be able to tell a scenario, so okay, with and without energy information technology, those are my demand elasticity. So I think that is, it's practical but feasible. I think one type of behavioral issues that are really important and much more challenging is when it comes to peer effects. And for a lot of new technologies, I feel that this is very important, and that also matters quite a bit.
What do you mean by peer effects?
Peer effects, I'm pretty sure that your daughter, great idea to take the electric scooter, is probably informed by her friends doing it, and you know, to which extent the behavior of one person propagate influence the behavior of others. And I think when it comes to new technology and energy model, this is the challenge to take that into account, which explains that preferences are advantageous in some extent. And so I would say that, going back to your question, income might be a first order effect. Then there's a whole range of behavioral issues that we should pay attention to in energy model. I think we can play with demand elasticities, maybe to take that into account. But the one that I would put as an energy model a lot of money on to get right as a behavioral issue would be probably peer effects. And that's my 2 cents.
Ken, I want to add to it, you've studied some of the peer effects.
I have. First, I want to get back to your question, which is, I think there's a lot. What's really interesting, I agree with Karen that in the short run, the way NEMS is set up, the way most energy models are set up, often has behavioral anomalies baked into them. NEMS, for example, as Karen knows very well, has high implicit discount rates built in for the adoption of a lot of new appliances and other household decisions being made. So they're baked in. Where it gets really interesting, especially as we look out further, is when we start to have new technologies. And that gets closer to what Sebastien was saying. And I think that when we're seeing a large, widespread adoption of new technologies that we don't have historical data or very much historical data to calibrate on, then these behavioral biases, we don't know how to calibrate it. We don't have them baked in the same way. So when we make longer run forecasts, understanding that interaction between these new technologies can make these behavioral biases incredibly important in where demand is going to be going in the future. Getting back to the peer effects, yeah, I guess Sebastien set me up to give him a plug for my own work. But I do have a bit of work on understanding consumers' decisions to adopt, for example, solar photovoltaics. And so if your neighbors install solar, you're more likely to install solar. And I dive into some of the detailed issues that underpin this. So if solar is more visible, for example, you tend to see that effect is stronger. So it's on the front side of your house when you're driving down the street. But thinking through how these affect the diffusion, I mean, we can get back to the BAS model and classic models of diffusion of new technologies implicitly are based on some contagion being in there. So it's not like the idea of contagion of new technologies is new, but understanding how they intersect with behavioral biases is, I think, a really particularly fascinating area that I feel that we're just beginning, we're at the cusp of understanding better.
Can I throw in one specific example and see if you guys can take a crack at how you would think about this using this combination of neoclassical thinking, behavioral thinking? I think in the personal mobility transportation, there's really 3 things that are happening simultaneously. One, we're beginning to bring in electric vehicles from the internal combustion vehicles. Second, we have the rise of mobility as a service. Think of Uber and Lyft. I have a son that when his car got towed away for too many parking tickets, and I said, don't you want to buy another one? And nah, I just use Uber all the time. He lives in Los Angeles. And then I sat down and we decided actually it's cheaper to do Uber all the time than actually buy a car and pay all the parking tickets and everything. So that's mobility as a service going on. And then there's going to be the rise of autonomous vehicles. Those are all happening simultaneously. And if we want to understand the demand for gasoline and the demand for parking services and the demand for road services and the demand for electricity, you think you want to know how those 3 works out. Do the behavioral issues that you're thinking about, combined with neoclassical, help you come to grips with this, or is this still too hard to handle? Silence.
I mean, I think it's a combination of things. Like the peer effect is definitely part of, like you're going to go for a ride in the stranger's car, but people are doing it, and it's working out, and it's cheaper, and it's convenient. and you know what the price is going to be before you get in the car. I mean, there's a lot of advantages to having one of these electronic services made possible by the phone. So that sort of these features kind of distinguish it perhaps from other options that don't involve you driving your own car. I mean, and there is sort of a wave away from, like you mentioned your son, I mean, a lot of young people, not only are they not buying cars, they're like not learning to drive. And if you realize this future where there's autonomous vehicles and transportation as a service alike, then maybe they can do a lot of getting around with that. So, but there's economics to it too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's very fundamental about these examples, and I completely agree that all three are going to be and potentially incredibly important for demand for gasoline going forward, is that they're really changing the service. There is some framing under the neoclassical framework that helps us understand when you bring in new services that you really can see some very large shifts in demand. So this is a case, actually, you can relate to the rebound effect of energy efficiency policy. We may be improving efficiency in some ways, but we're dramatically changing the service. That could be an example with electric vehicles. And so if we're really changing the service, there could be a very large rebound effect in this case. And these types of things can actually mean, some of those things could actually mean that we're going to have much higher demand for driving and for overall mobility. But on the flip side, some of these are going to allow us to also get from point A to point B potentially in an easier way. So there are forces that are working in the other direction. And there have been a series of papers out there that show that this really is ambiguous, that we don't know. So autonomous vehicles, for example, we don't know exactly which direction that's going to have on overall gasoline demand. There could be substantial induced demand from people wanting to take additional trips. And so it's actually quite a challenging, interesting area. But behavior matters here too, because it does matter how quickly we're going to be adopting these new technologies. Who is willing to adopt these new technologies? How do they come onto the market? Are they all going to be in a few places, or are they going to be distributed over a wide range of areas? Those things end up mattering, whether it's for the final leg of a trip, and it's used for that, or is it being used for the entire trip and for induced trips? So behavioral considerations play a real role, I see, even in these considerations.
Do you think this may make a fundamental difference in the shape of cities? For example, if you can get an autonomous Uber, so you don't have to pay the labor costs of an Uber, and it's really cheap to commute, and nobody's going to bug you while you're in the car, and so you can get a lot of work done. Why not live 2 hours away from where you're going to work in a place where it's now is much cheaper, and therefore will the structure of cities start changing in ways, except for the fact that there'll be so much more congestion, we may be worried about it, but if we can work and play video games in our car on the way in, why do we care about congestion? Is that the sort of thing that may be happening with this combination of things?
Or Jim, we could link the vehicles so that we don't have
Congestion. Yeah, they talk to each other and they just...
Like, so they linked, and you just, then you could do it for 3-hour driving. So those people who want to, instead of working in Washington, you work in Washington, D.C., but you live in West Virginia. And West Virginia, you just commute in, and, it takes a long time, but you get... So I guess those are sort of there'll be a set of behavioral considerations. Do we even know how to begin to come to grips with these, or is this just cutting edge where it's all total speculation at this point?
Yeah. When it comes to the empirical research, the most difficult projects are, we can model or use data to analyze what type of cars people choose, maybe mode choice. But when it comes to where to live and what type of building to live in, this is where we are moving slowly but surely away from the data, and we don't have good models, I would say empirical models to do that, even though that we have data for more than 100 years of people making those. And so I think I'm not too optimistic that we'll be able to do a good job ex ante to analyze those decisions. But there are nice, small, natural experiments, slowly but surely, that can inform a bit the debates. And if you think about what you described, well, that's what happened in Silicon Valley, where people really want to live in San Francisco for some reasons, and they commute to Mountain View and so on, and spend a couple of hours. And you know, those are useful
buses.
Yeah, Google buses, and I mean, this is useful data and the case studies to start with. So, from an economist point of view, this maybe not where the highest quality papers, but from a social science point of view, there's a lot there, and I'm not sure how it has been studied or if we have capitalized on those natural experiments. But there is something to be said or to be done with what we have.
Okay. Okay, unless one of you wants to comment more on this, I'd like to change the topic a little bit. It was mentioned that there's energy innovation. The example of energy innovation was cannabis farming inside. I mean, that's a whole new use. We've had in the past, the rise of air conditioning is a whole new use. Growth of information technology. You know, take these autonomous vehicles, I just learned, they actually process a lot of information. They use a lot of energy for information processing in an autonomous vehicle. And is there anything we can say behaviorally about what causes, motivates, encourages energy innovation of in either direction? Either direction of things that will use more energy or use less energy. Now the world can move in either direction.
I can make at least one distinction while the others continue thinking. Is I think it's really crucial to think about the distinction between energy innovation that changes energy services and energy innovation that improves energy efficiency. And those are two crucial things that are both going on at the same time. What I said before, we've seen this downward trend in the overall energy intensity of the economy. There's constantly innovation going on in energy intensity, but there are also sectoral shifts and services that are actually being provided and used are changing. So I don't have a full answer to this, obviously, but I think one crucial thing that when we're thinking about future energy demand and how innovation plays a role, the addition of new energy services can potentially offset a heavily energy intensive use already, and so it could end up being on net a case where the energy use decreases, but it could also provide a new service that people want that use a lot of energy, and so it could be on net increasing energy use, and that is distinctly different than the same energy service and improving the efficiency of that energy service. So, you know, it's the same refrigerator and improving the energy efficiency of that refrigerator. Both of those are innovations that matter and directly impact the long run energy demand.
If we're trying to make predictions to either decarbonize the economy or keep energy security or invest in new refineries or anything else that we end up doing, is there ways to start quantifying the roles of these various roles of these innovation factors and how they may make a difference? And let me just expand this by just reminding what was started at the beginning is the rate of change of energy intensity of the economy, energy per unit of GDP, it varied between about 1.5% and 3% a year on a decade-by-decade basis ever since 1973. That's involved a lot of innovation of energy use, a lot of new technology that didn't get invented by accident. Somebody decided to make some changes and invented new things that were energy efficient. Is there things that we know how to quantify whether this is going to continue to happen, whether this is going to go away, whether having a particular administration in Washington in a bully pulpit may make a difference in the rate of the change of it? Do we know this, or do we just count on what's the future directions of change being just like they've been for the last 30 years?
I think some of those changes actually have come about in response to government requirements or standards. So, you know, in the case of cars, I mean, the CAFE standards have been pretty binding in terms of what people achieve. And so, to the extent that aspirations there are slowing down, or efforts to kind of influence the course of technology towards being more energy efficient is slowing, then that will have ramifications. But another thing that will have implications for, and has in the past been a driving factor of innovation, is the path of energy prices. And energy has gotten cheap lately, with both because natural gas prices are low as a result of fracking, but also the costs of new cleaner technologies are coming down. So those could be both forces that might cause people to look to be about saving other input costs as they innovate, perhaps.
Not sure that I will really answer that question.
That's okay, ask your own question.
I just want to say something. You know, I think I was not there for the whole past 45 years looking at this rate. You know, it seems to me that the rate of innovation in terms of energy efficiency was pretty constant. You know, it was steady but constant. If you think at the macro level, a lot of sectors, well, this is exponential. If you think about computing, cloud, and so on, so there are sectors that are, you know what it means. In aggregate, we are pretty steady. There are sectors that are fading fast, and other sectors that are growing pretty fast. To make on average a steady increase. And I think, you know, thinking about the future, I think what might be important to consider in terms of innovation, and thinking also about what behavioral issues are important to think about the importance of those innovations, is I think decentralization in the energy market will play a big role in changing how fast innovation will spread in the energy sector. And one thing that is also, you know, what is the behavioral issue that interact with this decentralization? And I think this is the issue of trust. That historically we used to have the big utility having all the data, providing the services and so on. Cars, we have their own car, we pay for gas, we know how it works and so on. But if we think about automation, if we think about the microgrid and so on, now we are trading, you know, peer-to-peer and so on, and trust, and how we think as humans or as decision-makers in those systems, decentralized systems, will be pretty important to make sense of this information. So, basically 2 words, decentralization and trust, are, I think, 2 important buzzwords to think about innovation and how it will play out according to.
And I think there are some lessons in terms of introduction of energy efficient technologies that people who are, or energy using, but particularly energy efficient ones, that didn't necessarily go so well, like compact fluorescent light bulbs that didn't perform up to snuff initially, and that really kind of backfired a lot in terms of those things penetrating. Now, arguably, LEDs are superior, and certainly in terms of how long they live, and perhaps in terms of quality of light. But when thinking about other technologies that are penetrating, there might be some lessons from those mistakes, because certainly for autonomous vehicles, trust is a big deal, I think.
Well, speaking of trust, we're in Washington, D.C. right now, the center of trust. There's been lots of, at least, rhetoric of change from the current administration. Deregulation is happening. There's been some attacks on appliance efficiency standards, attacks on the CAFE standards. the bully pulpit matters. Do you see that anything is happening right now in the Washington policy environment that is going to make a significant effect on the demand for energy over time? Or are the changes we're seeing likely to have just a second order effect? What's big that if you care about the demand for energy that's really happening now that you got to pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the two biggest, when you looked at the previous administration's analyses and reports, fair disclosure, I was a senior economist in 2015-16 at the White House under the Council of Economic Advisors for Energy and the Environment, so I read a lot of these reports. Some of them I made, but mostly I read and remarked on. But if you looked at, their deep decarbonization report or those reports, the two biggest components of those reports were the Clean Power Plan and were fuel economy standards. Now, there were a whole bunch of other pieces. You could think of them as wedges going back to Socolo, but there were a bunch of other pieces. Those are the two biggest. Both of those, I guess you would say at the moment, are postponed, or you may know the rollback of the fuel economy standards this summer came out, and that the proposed rule, of course, that's to go to a final rule, basically flatlines them after 2021 until 2026. Now, this is particularly important because, at least for cars, regulatory certainty really, really matters to the automakers. It's a 10-year design process, so it's not likely that there's going to be a ramp up immediately after, even if we had a new administration. They could start later in the time period. So there's some postponement, even if you had a different administration come in there. Of course, it has to hold up in the courts, and there's a whole lot going on there. Clean Power Plan is a similar situation where effectively the Clean Power Plan is on pause, is one way to put it, and then there's the replacement that will come out that has been proposed, and we see that as well, and that also has a dramatic demand. And where that matters most for demand is that there was going to be an emphasis on energy efficiency in the Clean Power Plan. It was no longer one of the building blocks for people who are familiar with this, but it was actually quite important in the Clean Power Plan in meeting the goals cost effectively. So there'll be less emphasis in the next several years. Now, this is just U.S., and so we should think about these things more broadly, because there's a lot going on more broadly. And then we should also think about things not just internationally, but also subnationally. And at the subnational level, many states are pushing forward, doing a lot of the things that were going to be happening anyway. We just saw the large conference out in California, and Governor Brown making statements about very deep decarbonization. There's a lot going on around the world as well. So it actually is a very interesting situation where you see certain rollbacks happening to key planks that unquestionably, even if you had a new administration come in, would be playing a real role in energy demand and understanding how energy demand is going to be changing. If you had an administration, things will change afterwards, but there's a lot going on elsewhere that you also have to keep in mind if you're an energy modeler and you really want to understand how demand is going to be changing. Karen can add to that, I'm sure.
Right, well, I think it is true that a lot of states and even cities are stepping up with respect to both carbon policies and plans. I mean, in New York State, they're talking about folding in the price of CO2 into the operation of the independent system operator. And there are states that are currently in RGGI are trying to get other states to come along. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, caps CO2 emissions in the Northeast, and Virginia is on the verge of joining once they establish their own state final rule. And New Jersey is going back in, and other states are looking at this potential opportunity to join this growing market. So things are happening. I think one of the comments I would make about the Affordable Clean Energy proposal, which is the proposed replacement to the clean power plan is that because it's very, very focused on what can be accomplished at coal plants, and it takes like a plant by plant specific approach as opposed to create